morning, everyone, and welcome to Mission Control 2026. So over this webinar series, we're going to take sort of like a control room view of quality in vet and looking at our systems, the signals and the indicators that tell us whether our RTO is operating safely, consistently and compliantly. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So today we're starting with one of the areas that lights up the dashboard for regulars more than almost anything else, and that's recognition of prior learning and credit transfer. So these processes sound straightforward, but in reality they sit right at the intersection of assessment integrity, certification integrity, and of course regulatory oversight. So today our job in the control room is to run a systems check on recognition and credit transfer. So recognition is one of those areas where the consequences of weak systems can escalate very quickly. If recognition decisions are made without sufficient evidence, the issue is not just a paperwork problem. It becomes a significant qualification integrity issue. And once qualification integrity is questioned, then it affects public safety, industry confidence, and of course the credibility of our nationally recognised training. So from a regulator's perspective, recognition is not just a process, it's a system control point. So think of it as one of those key instruments on your compliance dashboard. If it's miscalibrated, the whole system starts giving unreliable signals. So let's look at some of those warning lights that the regulator is watching for when it comes to recognition. So a common risk is how we promote RPL. So promoting RPL as easy, quick, or a guaranteed pathway to a qualification. When recognition is marketed this way, it often means the evidence is not being tested with the level of rigour that is required. Another signal appears when RPL processes operate outside of our assessment system or with reduced assessment controls. Because we have to remember that RPL is an assessment and it has to follow that same framework. Authenticity is another critical checkpoint. Evidence must be verified so the organisation is confident that it genuinely belongs to the learner. And we also see issues where RPL is granted automatically because a learner holds a higher AQF level qualification. That higher AQF qualification doesn't automatically demonstrate competence in every unit. And then finally, credit transfer decisions must always be confirmed with formal equivalence. If equivalence is assumed rather than verified, then the organisation might be granting recognition incorrectly. So in simple terms, recognition must always be evidence-based and aligned to the training product and not driven by marketing claims or enrolment pressures. So one of the most common issues regulators see is the confusion between recognition of prior learning and credit transfer. So we need to separate these clearly. So recognition of prior learning is assessment. It involves collecting and evaluating evidence of the learner's prior skills, their knowledge and their experience. And look, that evidence can come from many different areas: work experience, previous training, or other learning contexts, but it still needs to be assessed against the unit requirement. But when we talk about credit transfer, this is verification. The learner has already completed an equivalent unit and holds an AQF certification documentation. Oh, that's hard to say. Our role is simply to verify authenticity and confirm equivalence. So the distinction is really quite simple. but it is very important. RPL requires judgment. Credit transfer requires verification. If we blur that distinction, then our recognition systems start to break down. So recognition of prior learning, or RPL as we all call it, is, as we said, essentially an assessment process. And so what that means is that we're collecting and evaluating evidence of a learner's prior skills, knowledge, and experience. So that evidence might come from formal study, from workplace practice, or from other learning contexts. So the assessor needs to make a professional judgment about whether the learner already meets the requirements of the unit or the training product. So in practice, RPL means that decisions are based on evidence of prior learning and experience. And that process sits within the organisation's assessment system. So the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence still apply. And the final decision must be clearly documented and defensible. If we turn to the practice guides, it's very clear on this point. RPL must be applied with the same level of rigour as the assessment system. The RPL isn't automatic. It isn't granted simply because someone has a lot of experience, and it requires a qualified assessor to carefully evaluate the evidence and make a structured assessment judgment. So credit transfer is not an assessment process. Instead, it's an administrative recognition that that learner has already completed an equivalent unit or qualification. So in this situation, the learner has already been assessed as competent by another authorised organisation and has been issued that AQF certification. So our role is not to reassess the learner. Our role is to verify the documentation and confirm equivalence. So in practice, this means that the learner must have completed an equivalent unit or qualification. The request must be supported by AQF certification, documented or authenticated. Sorry, let me start that again. The request must be oh, is it Thursday? The request must be supported by AQF documentation or an authenticated vet transcript. That's what I'm trying to say. And the authenticity of the document must be verified, and the equivalence of the unit must be confirmed. And under Standard 1.7, organisations need to verify that that documentation is genuine. This may involve checking with the US transcript service or contacting the issuing organisation. We also need to confirm that the unit is equivalent, either because it has the same unit code and title, or because a superseded unit has been formally deemed equivalent on the National Register. So credit transfer is really a verification process, confirming prior documentation that has been certified rather than reassessing competence. So let's be really, let's just make sure that we understand that difference. RPL requires judgment, credit transfer requires verification. So RPL involves evaluating that evidence and making that assessment decision about whether or not that learner meets the unit requirements. Credit transfer involves confirming that the learner has already completed an equivalent unit and that the documentation is authentic. If equivalence can't be clearly confirmed or authenticity can't be verified, then the process should not proceed as credit transfer. Instead, the learner may need to be assessed through an RPL process. And so maintaining this distinction protects the integrity of the training product and ensures recognition decisions remain compliant and defensible. So Robust evaluation of evidence sits at the centre of the compliance recognition process. And whether the organisation is conducting recognition of prior learning or reviewing a credit transfer request, it must be able to show that decisions are based on clear and defensible evidence. And so there's three key considerations here: currency, authenticity, and equivalence. If any of these cannot be confirmed, the recognition decision might not be valid, and it creates a significant regulatory risk. So, currency refers to whether the evidence demonstrates current competence against the requirements of the training product. And so when we're assessing RPL, the assessor needs to consider whether the skills and the knowledge reflect current industry practice, whether the legislation or the regulatory requirements have changed, and whether the training package has been updated, and whether the evidence shows ongoing application of competence. So if the evidence is outdated or no longer aligns with current standards, it can't be supported. It can't support a valid assessment decision. And of course, in regulated or high-risk industries, currency becomes particularly important because, changes in licensing and regulatory frameworks mean that older evidence may no longer reflect what those current requirements are. And so for credit transfer, currency is usually addressed through the confirmed equivalence. However, if, again, regulatory or contextual requirements have changed significantly, we may need to consider additional evidence or an RPL assessment. Authenticity, it's about being confident that the evidence presented is genuine and actually belongs to the learner. So when assessing RPL, there are a number of ways assessors might check for authenticity. For example, they could verify the learner's identity. They could confirm the source of third-party reports, validate employer testimonials. Importantly, we should ask structured questions to test the learner's knowledge and check that those documents have not been altered or misrepresented. So if authenticity isn't properly verified, then recognition decisions could end up being based on inaccurate or misleading evidence. And of course, for credit transfer, authenticity is essential. The decision must be supported by an AQF certification document or an authenticated vet transcript. So organisations should verify documentation. We could check on the USI transcript service or contact the issuing organisation directly. Granting credit transfer without authenticity creates a significant compliance risk. Equivalence is a key part of credit transfer, and it can also inform RPL decisions when a learner presents evidence of prior formal training. In simple terms, evidence means confirming that the unit the learner previously completed is the same or officially deemed equivalent to a unit which credit is being requested. So we need to be really, really careful with this, that the unit does have the same code and title. And as we said earlier, superseded units, we need to make sure that they've been formally deemed equivalent on the National Register. Just saying, oh, look, the unit outcomes look similar doesn't automatically mean that it's equivalent. And so these assumptions based on similarity don't actually meet regulatory expectations. And, sometimes units of competence have been superseded several times. So in those cases, the organisation may need to undertake a mapping review to confirm that earlier units still actually cover the same requirements. And if gaps are identified, credit transfer should not be granted, and an RPL pathway may need to be considered instead. So let's just make sure that we're looking at those documents and making sure that they clearly confirm that that is an equivalent unit. One of the things that we need to be really aware of then too is how we put all of this together. So currency, authenticity and equivalence are not separate checks that are carried out in isolation. They should actually work together and form part of an integrated recognition system. So for RPL, evidence, current, authentic, valid and sufficient, and decisions are documented and justified. For credit transfer, documentation must be authentic, equivalence must be confirmed, and decisions must be recorded. And it's also important that we have alternate pathways available if equivalence can't be established. If any of these elements can't be clearly demonstrated, then we need to make sure that we go back to our learner and we ask for more evidence. We suggest that they take a different pathway. Maintaining the rigour in these checks protects the integrity of the training product. So I've got a little bit of a flow chart here that kind of looks at recognition versus credit transfer. So, let's check the documentation. Has an AQF certification documentation been approved? If yes, we can identify it. If no, we move to RPL. So step 1 is really important. Step 2 then, verify the authenticity. Have those documents been confirmed? If no, no credit transfer. Consider RPL. If yes, confirm that equivalence. Is it the same unit? Is it formally equivalent, we would say? If yes, grant RPL and document the decision. If no, we go to that RPL process again. And so where RPL does apply, then the full process should be followed. Evaluate the evidence, test the currency, verify authenticity, identify and address the gaps. And of course, documentation of the assessment judgment is essential. So RPL isn't just a process that you work through, it is actually an assessment decision. And that means it needs to be backed by a competent assessor, solid evidence and clear oversight. And so because it is an assessment, it has to be treated with that same level of rigour as any other assessment activity in your organisation. And it's not something separate or easier. Recognition of prior learning must be conducted by individuals who meet the trainer and assessor competence requirements under the standards. And so that assessor who's responsible for that RPL decision must hold the required training and assessment credentials. They should maintain current industry skills and knowledge relevant to that training product and be able to interpret the training product requirements accurately. And then they need to exercise professional judgment consistent with the assessment system. And so if we look at the practice guide, it does make it clear that assessors responsible for evaluating RPL evidence, including those engaged through third parties, must meet the competence requirements of Standard 3.2 and 3.3. RPL involves a high level of professional judgment. And sort of unlike standard assessment tasks, the evidence presented through RPL can come from many different places. And so it might include work experience, prior study, professional practice, or other forms of learning. And it's often varied and non-standard. And so because of this, assessors need to be able to evaluate a wide range of evidence from different contexts and determine whether the evidence is sufficient valid and authentic. Identify any gaps between the evidence provided and the unit requirements, and decide what additional evidence or gap training or further assessment might mean. So we look at my own situation, and like I did my Bachelor of Vocational Education back in 2000 and something. Now, is that if I gave that certificate from the university, from Charles Sturt University to you, would you be able to say, oh yes, Nerida is competent to be training the TAE course or doing recognition of prior learning? The answer would be a big fat no, because that's not current. Think of all the changes that have happened in our industry over those years. But when we take into account that I've been in this industry for, you won't say how many years, and I've been consistently working in the industry, then that's a different matter. So yes, we could take that as part of our documented evidence, but we also want to be asking me some really pointed questions about my experience. So we don't want to be granting RPL without properly credentialed and competent assessors making those decisions. All RPL decisions must be transparent, must be documented, and must be defensible. Defensible is a word that ASQA is using in all of their practice guides, in all of their literature. Defensible. We need to be able to clearly show what evidence the learner provided, how that evidence was evaluated against the unit requirements, and how the assessor reached the final decision, and then whether or not there was any gaps in competence were identified, and then what additional training or assessment was required. We need to have that clear documentation to ensure that RPL decisions are consistent, traceable, and able to withstand review or audit. So if the auditor comes in and was asked that particular assessor why they made that decision, we need to have that documentation, because I'm not going to remember what I did yesterday, let alone nearly 12 months ago. So that documentation, extremely important. So the practice guide does emphasise that RPL decisions, again, must be transparent, defensible, and documented outcomes. And the documentation should show mapping of the evidence to the unit requirements, notes supporting assessor judgment, confirmation that currency has been considered, and steps taken to verify authenticity, and then the formal outcome of the assessment. So inadequate record keeping, including failure to retain those RPL documentation, is identified as a known risk to quality outcomes. So recognition decisions must therefore be recorded clearly and in sufficient detail to withstand regular scrutiny. And as we said earlier, RPL doesn't sit outside of your organisation assessment system. It also needs to be validated and have a continuous improvement framework. And so under Standard 1.5, assessment systems must be validated on a risk-based cycle. And this includes our RPL practices and our assessment judgments. So our organisation should be able to demonstrate that RPL tools and processes are regularly reviewed. The RPL assessment decisions are sampled and validated, and that the risks associated with RPL are identified and managed. So that validation outcome should inform the improvements made to the RPL system. The practice guide makes it clear that RPL practices must be validated and monitored to ensure that decisions are consistently made in accordance with the standards. High-risk training products, licensing outcomes, or identified system weaknesses may require more frequent validation and monitoring. And so those monitoring activities may include analysing trends in RPL approvals and refusals, reviewing how gap training or further assessment is applied, and checking consistency between assessors, reviewing the quality and the completeness of the documentation. So RPL should be treated as a system-level risk area, not just an admin process. Regular monitoring helps ensure that our decisions are consistent, compliant, and, that word again, defensible. Recognition of prior learning must be governed with the same structural controls as any other assessment activity. So, just repeating, appropriately qualified assessors, documentation of defensible assessment decisions, and validation and monitoring of the RPL processes. When all of these controls are embedded in the RPL operates as a quality control process rather than a regulatory vulnerability. Let's have a little bit more of a look at credit transfer, because we know that credit transfer, while we said it was an administrative decision, it's not necessarily an administrative convenience. It is a regulated process for recognising prior certified achievement. And so again, decisions must be transparent and evidence-based and consistently applied. Because under Standard 1.7, credit transfers decisions must be fair, documented, and maintain the integrity of the training product. So all credit transfer decisions must be formally recorded. And the documentation should clearly show the unit for which the credit was requested, the unit previously completed, the evidence that was reviewed, how the equivalence was confirmed, and the outcome of the decision. And then, of course, whether the credit transfer has been granted, the record should be able to show the basis on which that evidence or that equivalence was determined. And where it's refused, the documentation should clearly explain the reason for that decision. So clear and consistent records help keep the credit transfer decisions as a fair and scrutiny so that those decisions are fair and can actually undertake scrutiny at an audit. So we need to remember about this whole authenticity, making sure that it's demonstrated through the documents that we are looking at, making sure that we do authenticity checks for confirming the identity of the learner, verifying that the qualification or the statement of attainment, to make sure that hasn't been altered, that it's clear, and confirming that the issuing organisation was authorised to issue the certification. And I think in today's world where ASQA is taking away registration from so many RTOs, that's one of the things we need to be really careful when we're looking at credit transfer, because has that issuing organisation, were they actually accredited at the time? So granting credit transfer without confirming that authenticity is a known compliance risk. We've got to be sure that that documentation is genuine before our credit transfer is awarded. Again, just reiterating about the equivalence. The unit has to have the same code and title, or we need to be able to show that it is a superseded unit that has been deemed equivalent on the National Register. So we can't assume that equivalence. Similar units don't mean automatic equivalence. We need to make sure that we're looking at that we're carrying out a mapping review to confirm that earlier units still cover the same outcomes. And of course, if gaps are identified, It's just put our people through an RPL process. We must make sure that before we actually approve credit transfer, that it's clearly confirmed and properly documented. So when credit transfer can't be granted, where we can't confirm that equivalence, or we're a bit sus about the authenticity of the documentation, then we need to give that learner a different pathway. So the practice guide encourages organisations to offer alternate pathways, such as recognition of prior learning. So this helps ensure that the process remains fair, transparent, and accessible for all learners who still may be able to demonstrate competence, but just can't verify those documents. And it also keeps us then consistent with standard 1.6. So when we refuse credit transfer, just make sure that we clearly explain why the request could not be approved and what other recognition options are available. And then give the learner some ideas about what other evidence they might need to provide. Credit transfer is really about verification, not reassessment. So in other words, we're not reassessing the learner's competence, we're just confirming that they've already completed that equivalent unit and that the documentation is genuine. So we need to have a system in place so that these decisions are clearly documented, that the authenticity of the documentation is verified, and that equivalence between units is confirmed. When we put these controls, if we apply them consistently, credit transfer becomes a simple but well-controlled verification process. And we're protecting that integrity of the qualification and that confidence in the training system. The practice guides, and I've spent a lot of time going through and looking at the practice guides. And one of the things that I think is really important when we look at the practice guides is their risks parts of it. And so the practice guide identifies failure to verify authenticity as a known risk to quality outcomes. So this means really that we don't accept anything at face value. We need to check whether it's genuine, that they're accurate, that the documents haven't been altered, and that we can actually attribute that documentation to that particular learner. So documentation becomes then a risk. And look, there's a number of reasons, it could be altered or falsified. How easy it is in today's world to get into one of our software programs and make a fantastic certificate that comes from what we think is a recognised organisation that is completely false. So we've got to make sure that those documents are issued by an organisation that is actually authorised to issue nationally recognised qualifications. Sometimes our document is incomplete, or it's misrepresented, or presented by someone who's not actually the legitimate holder of that qualification. So we need to make sure that we look at that documentation. Where we're in industries that involve licensing, I think that this is where we really need to be very vigilant, because high-risk work or regulated professional practice, authenticity checks become even more important. So if we did a credit transfer without properly verifying that documentation, there's a risk that somebody could enter a role that they don't have the competence to work in. So, this could then impact on our public safety, our clients' welfare, workplace safety, and of course, compliance with regulatory industries. And so the issue goes well beyond just regulatory compliance. If those decisions are made without proper verification, well, it can definitely lead to reputational damage, as we've seen with so many RTOs, and in some cases, potential legal liability for that organisation. It's also important to remember that regulators just don't look at individual decisions. They look at the recognition system as a whole. So if authenticity checks are missing or applied inconsistently, that can sort of indicate a broader weakness in the organisation's governance framework. So some of the common indicators that regulators look for. So we've got no clear documented process for verifying authenticity. Different staff apply verification checks in different ways, and little or no recording of that evidence to show that those authenticity checks were actually carried out. And then reliance on student declarations without any independent verification. So when these type of patterns appear, it suggests that our recognition decisions may not be applied with the same level of rigour that the standards expect. Credit transfer decisions are often very visible indicators of an organisation's quality control. If an RTO becomes known for granting credit transfer without properly verifying those documents or confirming that equivalence, it can quickly show how the organisation is viewed by industry and regulators. So again, we've got reputational damage. We've got damage to industry relationships, increased regulatory scrutiny. And so maintaining those decisions isn't just about compliance, it also helps our organisation's credibility and our standing within the training system. So authenticity shouldn't be something we simply assume. It needs to be actively checked. If authenticity isn't properly verified, then it's not just a small administrative oversight, it's a huge gap in the organisational control process. And when that happens, it can undermine both the integrity of the qualification and the standing with ASQA. So I would say that recognition sits in that high risk category, and we need to make sure that we understand that the regulator is watching our dashboard closely. So across the sector, regulators have identified a number of points where recognition systems tend to kind of drift off course. And so these are the spots where things most commonly go wrong. So what we want to do is think of them as warning lights in our control room, because if we understand these risks, then we can sort of tighten things and make sure our processes are strengthened so that we can avoid finding ourselves on ASPRA's radar. So things that we don't want to see happening in our RPL or our credit transfer systems. So we don't want to see reduced evidence requirements just to speed up the outcome. We don't want to accept incomplete or unclear documentation or skip the mapping of the evidence to the unit requirement or grant RPL simply because someone has general industry experience. So it's these kinds of shortcuts that might seem harmless at the time, but they quickly undermine the validity of the assessment decision. Another area where things can go wrong is outsourcing RPL without proper oversight. If a third party is involved, the registered training organisation still remains responsible for compliance. So there's a few things we definitely don't want to see in these situations. And that's where third-party assessors don't meet the required credentialing requirements, that the RTO isn't validating the RPL's decisions being made, and if there's little or no oversight of the processes or the documentation. So our contracts with third parties, they can't be vague. They must be very, very rigorous with the compliance requirements that we would expect in our own organisation. So when third parties aren't monitored with the same level of rigour as our internal assessments, it can quickly become a system level governance issue rather than just an operational one. So what we don't want to do is to ignore gaps in competence. So when RPL evidence doesn't fully meet the required requirements, the assessor needs to identify those gaps and put into place some sort of structured training or further assessment. So the problems start to occur when, like we take a few shortcuts. So we treat partial competence as full competence, or not documenting where the gaps were identified. And of course, having no clear pathway to address the missing skills or knowledge. And then delivering gap training informally without recording that it was done. So when these gaps aren't managed properly, the assessment judgment becomes difficult to justify. And then another area that is on the radar is where we're dealing with our credit transfer too casually. Credit transfers, as we said, must be based on authenticated and verified information. So the problem starts to rise when an organisation relies on a quick visual check of the documentation instead of properly verifying it. So we can't rely only on visual inspection of the document. We can't assume that the issuing organisation is legitimate without confirming it. We shouldn't skip identity checks for our learners or accept documentation that has been altered or somehow falsified. And so this failure, as we've said, is one of the most significant compliance risks in that credit transfer process. So one thing that is a huge, serious risk is issuing a qualification made up entirely of units gained through RPL or credit transfer from another RTO. We simply don't do this. The problem arises where the RTO has little or no involvement in the training or the assessment, that the qualification isn't effectively issued that the qualification is basically reissued rather than delivered, and the organisation can't show its own quality assurance oversights. So even if the units were completed elsewhere, the RTO issuing the qualification is still responsible for the integrity of the certification it awards. ASQA sees that there is complaint from learners who have their credit transfer or their recognition refused without having a clear and transparent information about why that decision was made. So this means that we do need to document the reason for the refusal, explain the rationale to the learner, and offer alternative pathways such as RPL. So problems arise when refusal decisions appear arbitrary, when the reasons aren't recorded, or when learners aren't told about other recognition options. So when decisions aren't transparent, it often leads to complaints, appeals, and of course, increased regulatory security. One other thing to keep in mind is that credit transfer context, as we said, in those licensings and regulated work areas. Problems arise when organisations assume equivalence without checking jurisdictional licensing differences. We see this a lot in areas like real estate, where the underpinning legislation is different in each state. And so we can't just blanketly say this person can have the unit of competence that says understand legislation. We can't overlook changes in legislation or regulatory frameworks. And if we don't review that how that contextualization comes into place, then we might find that we're not giving out the qualification correctly or sufficiently. So we want to have some way of thinking about how we're going to manage our risks. And so recognition of prior learning and credit transfer sort of sits at the intersection of assessment integrity, certification integrity, and regulatory requirement compliance. And so because these processes, we need to find any weaknesses in the system that could have immediate or significant consequences. And so that's why it's really helpful to take a step back and look at our recognition from a system perspective. And so a recognition risk map highlights where control points in the process and the common areas where things can start to go wrong. So we've sort of got a little look about some of those things that we could put in our risk management process. So risk one, system design failures, is where the recognition process or credit transfer, we'll put them all into one bag, sits outside of the assessment system. Regulators expect recognition to be designed and applied with the same rigour as the assessment system. Inadequate evidence. One of the biggest risks simply accepting evidence at face value without checking it properly. We need to make sure that the currency authenticity is verified. So this can creep in when equivalence is assumed instead of being properly confirmed, or where RPL is automatically granted because someone holds that higher qualification. So the problem is when these things happen, you end up certifying people who aren't actually competent. And so this undermines everything, our organisation and the integrity of that qualification. Let's look at our assessor capability. RPL shouldn't be made by just anyone. It needs to be handled by properly qualified assessors with current industry knowledge and the ability to make sound judgments. So if our assessors lack those credentials or they don't work within that industry anymore, or they will struggle to evaluate non-standard evidence and decisions can become inconsistent. Another issue comes up when decisions can't be clearly explained later, especially when you're audited. You might find there's no clear record of what evidence was actually reviewed. There's no mapping. There's nothing showing how that evidence links to the unit requirements, and no indication that authenticity checks were done. You know, sometimes the reasons for approving or refusing recognition aren't well documented, and the record keeping overall is inconsistent. So there's no clear trail of how these decisions are made. And if you can't quickly explain and support that decision with proper records, then the whole system starts to be exposed. RPL can't simply be outsourced and forgotten about. We do need to remember that a qualification that has been assessed by a third party still is the responsibility of our RTO because we are issuing that qualification. And then I think this is a really crucial point. We have so much pressure. Recognition should never be marketed as easy, fast, guaranteed, fast track. No, they're not words that we should be using. When RPL is documented as automatic or driven by enrolment targets or rushed, when we reduce the evidence scrutiny, it becomes a regulatory red flag. Recognition isn't a shortcut to a qualification. It still requires proper evidence and sound assessment judgment. Credit transfer, let's make sure that our documentation is always checked and that if we can't verify, that we can't ensure that that documentation is sufficient, then don't issue credit transfer. let our learner go down the RPL path instead. Recognition failures often follow a predictable pattern. It usually starts with a weak policy or confusion between RPL and credit transfer. Then it moves through inconsistent evidence and evaluation, poor documentation, or weak validation, and before eventually attracting regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. So that's why our recognition systems need to be actively monitored, validated regularly, and recalibrated. And if you see something that's not working properly, don't just let it continue. Let's let's come back and let's fix this up. So I suppose as we near the end of this presentation, recognition is a high control system. So from mission control, we want to make sure that those key instruments are reading correctly. And so that means RPL is operating within the assessment system. Evidence is tested for currency, authenticity, and equivalence, and recognition decisions are made by properly credentialed assessors. Decisions must be clearly documented, third-party activity monitored with the same rigour as internal assessments, and marketing must never misrepresent recognition pathways. So when we've got all of these controls working at the same level, then we've got a recognition system that is well managed and has good quality control. It keeps our organisation on course. We need to have control checks, and this is where these control checks become really important. Checklists are designed to help an organisation systematically review RPL and credit transfer processes. They reflect the regulatory expectations as well as common high-risk areas highlighted in the practice guide. And ideally, your organisation should be able to answer yes to each control point and show clear evidence that those controls are in place and working in practice. You know, look, if I do an example of a marketing risk control, RPL is not promoted as easy, fast, or guaranteed. Marketing accurately represents recognition processes, and staff are trained to manage learner expectations regarding recognition outcomes. And commercial pressures don't influence the recognition decisions. So we could have a checklist for each of those particular areas so that then we can show we've got a compliance system. We should do a risk audit. It's essential for our system diagnostics. It allows our organisation to step back, check that all the instruments, and identify any warning lights that are starting to flash before the issues turn into audit findings, whether they turn into complaints or reputational damage. In mission control terms, the goal is very simple. Spot the drift early, recalibrate the system, and keep the recognition process safely on course. I've got an example here. It's probably a little bit hard to see. It's in the notes that you'll get on Monday. But what this example shows that recognition failure rarely happens all at once. Instead, they build up slowly. A weak policy here, inconsistent evidence checks, documentation that isn't quite complete, and validation that isn't picking things up. Before long, the system does start to drift off course. So recognition systems should be treated as high control areas within the organisational risk framework. So this means that they need to have clear oversight, structured processes, and consistent monitoring. And when risks are identified as high or extreme, Organisations should respond with strong controls, such as documented procedures, increased validation sampling, senior oversight, internal audits, and of course, targeted staff training. The recognition process should operate within that structured and identified integrated parts of the assessment system. So if your checklist highlights a gap, then do something about it. So as we bring this session in for a landing, remember that what we've covered today is really just the big picture view of recognition and credit transfer compliance. We've looked at the rules and the expectations in the outcome standards and the warning lights that regulators are looking for. So in other words, we've been sitting in our seat in mission control and looking at the control panel. What we haven't done is fully explored the hands-on side of RPL. That's where assessors actually evaluate the evidence, test the currency, verify authenticity, and use their professional judgment to make those defensible decisions. So let's think of today as setting up the navigation system. The next step in the learning is how to fly the spacecraft, and that means developing the practical skills, the tools that are needed to apply RPL confidently, consistently, and in real assessment situations. So before we finish, I just wanted to mention that we're currently developing a PD in Action series that's focused on the practical skills and application. So whilst our main PD program is the higher level overview of each of these topics, what we'll do then is have some deep dive topics, and these sessions will be offered as paid professional development program and designed for trainers, assessors, and compliance staff who want to strengthen their confidence and their capability in their day-to-day practice. So as I said, today we've concentrated on compliance framework and regulatory expectations. So the PD in Action series will go a step further and focus on the practical side of training and assessment. So across the series, we'll explore in our PD in Action practical steps for conducting RPL, understanding and responding to different learning styles, and strategies to increase learner engagement and participation. And these topics have come from feedback that we've had from you. So if you've got any other suggestion for a session, let me know, and we might be able to put that into our calendar as well. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. We truly appreciate your ongoing support of our professional development sessions and the part that you play in maintaining high quality training and assessment. So I look forward to seeing you in the next session. And you can see there on our calendar, we'll be sending that out to everyone again. So just to remember that your certificate of attendance, the PowerPoint slides, and the learning notes will be available on Monday, the 20th of April. If you have any questions, whatever, please don't hesitate to send them to me, nerida@taetraining.com.au. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Bye.